Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. And I like this book of Ephesians. Chapter 2 is a good chapter. You know they're all good chapters. Every time I turn to one of these, I think, here's one of my favorites. Here's one of my favorite chapters. And I've just got favorite chapters everywhere. But I appreciate the Apostle Paul, and I'm glad for all the things he wrote, because he had a lot of insight. And he didn't just dream it up, and he didn't just conjure it up, and he didn't get it from studying either. He got it from Jesus. If you know the story of the Apostle Paul, I'm going to turn that down. Pull that down just a second. If you know the story of the Apostle Paul, he was not one of the followers of Jesus, not one of the 12 disciples. He was a Pharisee, one of those group of people, those very religious people during Jesus' day that rejected his teaching, and rejected him, and really were complicit in his crucifixion, although Paul himself was not. We don't have any record that Paul was present at the crucifixion, or that he ever saw Jesus at all. But after the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, when the church was spreading, Paul had letters from the authorities in Jerusalem to go and persecute the Christians that were in Damascus. As you know, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. But Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And he can do that. Jesus knows how to intervene in our lives. And I know a lot of people sometimes say, well, I wish Jesus would appear to me that way. Well, maybe he figures you don't need that kind of dramatic intervention. You know, he knows how to get a hold of us. He knows who we are and how to reach us. And I just think Paul was just such a hard-headed person, Jesus had to go down personally. You know, I think that's kind of the case. Well, anyway, as you know, Paul was converted by this personal appearance to Jesus. But one of the things that Jesus told him in that appearance, he said, I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a witness of the things that you have seen and the things of which I will appear unto you. And I'm going to send you to the Gentiles to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan unto God. And so Paul set about to do that, and he had a message that he didn't get, as I said, from studying, though he was a studious person, though he was a smart person. He got a message from Jesus himself. And he wrote to the Galatians, and he said, I want you to know that the message that I'm preaching, I didn't get it from man. I didn't get it from Peter, James, and John. I got it from no less a source than Jesus Christ personally. So we can, as we say in our slang terminology, we can take it to the bank, what he has to say. We can count on it. We can depend on it. And Paul gives us a real insight into the way things work in the New Testament and in the New Covenant. And it's radical and it's revolutionary. And even today, 2,000 years after the facts of the gospel have taken place, in today's church world, Paul's teachings are radical. If everybody studied what he had to say and took it seriously, it wouldn't necessarily have to be that radical. But it seems to be. So I like to focus on, I don't know what it is about my personality. It makes me want to focus on the most radical parts of it. And the most radical thing Paul had to talk about was grace. And it's still radical today, and it was radical in his day. But here's a passage, we read this last week. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 says this, For by grace you were saved, or by grace are ye saved, through faith, that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. In this passage, in verse 8, it says, For by grace are ye saved through faith. And this gives us the two elements, if we want to call it an equation or of this statement, grace and faith. Grace is what God brings. Grace is what God does. Grace is God's part. Faith is our part. Now, our part is very small. In fact, I like what the Message translation says. It highlights this part of it in verse 8. Could you give me that, Elliot, real quick? It says, saving is all His idea, and it's all His work. All we do is trust Him enough to let Him do it. It's God's gift from start to finish. And the next verse says, I like this, we don't play the major role. If we did, we'd probably go around bragging that we'd done the whole thing. That's kind of funny. But look at what it says. We don't play the major role. Now, the reason this translator of the Message put it that way is because that's the thought that Paul is conveying here. He spends all of these two verses talking about God's grace and just devotes a single word to our part. That's because our part in this Christian life, our part in this relationship with God is very small, and it's limited to one single word, and that is faith or trust or reliance or placing our confidence in Him. That's what it means. That's what it means to believe in Him or to put our faith in Him. It's essential and it's important, but it's very small. We can't do it. We can't make it happen. We can't do anything, really, as far as our spiritual life is concerned. It's all His work from start to finish. I like the way He says it. Okay, Ellie, you can go back to King James again for verse 8 again. So last week, I spent the message talking about that part of faith. And we went through the Gospels, and we looked at some examples of people who had contact with Jesus, and He said to them things like, according as you have believed, so be it done unto you, and according to your faith, so be it done unto you, and fear not, your faith is saved, or things like that. He said that a lot to people. He always highlighted the human side of things, because He was coming as a container and as a deliverer and a transmitter of the grace of God. But Paul spends, I think this is important for us to notice here, and I wanted to talk about the grace side of it today. God's part is grace. It says, for by grace you're saved through faith. Now again, last week I kind of highlighted the fact that this word saved, if you look it up and study it, it's a broad word which means it can mean all kinds of deliverance. Really everything that God has for us, all of His workings in our life come under this category of saved. But in the basic sense of which we think of it, in terms of coming into right relationship with God, I think that's important too. By grace, you come into right relationship with God. Now that part of it is what's really radical, because most people instinctively don't think that way. I think instinctively, as human beings, we instinctively have a sense that there's a God, no matter who we are, no matter if we've been raised in church or not in church, no matter if we've been to college and heard other things. Some people say that sometimes they go to college and lose their faith. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. People have an instinctive knowledge of God. And the instinctive knowledge of God comes along with this, that God is perfectly righteous, perfectly holy, perfect in every way, and a righteous judge. And we, on the other hand, are somewhat short of that. I think people instinctively know that. And so what most people in the instinctive part of their mind, and we have a religious part of our makeup, whether we want to or not, we think that in order to be, if we're going to have any contact with this righteous and holy God, we've got to make ourselves righteous and holy, or the best we can. And so we either try or we give up. That depends if we're a Pharisee or, in the Gospels, there were two kinds of people that Jesus contacted, basically, the Pharisees and the sinners. And the Pharisees were those people that pretended like they were living up to God's standard, but they really weren't. And the sinners were those people who threw up their hands and said, I know I can't, so I'm not going to try. So whichever category we're in, Jesus comes, listen to this, not as a judge, not as a person who gives us what's coming to us, but delivering grace. And Paul here says, this is what's really radical. For by grace you're saved. Now, if I wanted to define saved as being in right relationship with God, I like the word saved. Saved is not a bad word. And here, you notice it's here, right here in the text. I remember one Sunday morning, probably this passage, because I've read this a lot. This was several years ago. There was a lady in the church that after the service was over, she came to me and she was really mad at me. It's hard to imagine that somebody would be mad at me because I'm so friendly. But she came up and was really mad at me, and she said, what is all this talk about saved? Why do you keep using this word saved? Why do I need to be saved? Isn't God love? What is all this talk about saved? And I wanted to say, well, look, I didn't say it. I wanted to say because I didn't want to seem like a smart aleck. I was kind of taken aback, I was trying to figure out what she was talking about, but I should have said, well, don't blame me. I'm just reading from the book. Look, see, I didn't make it up. It's not me making up the word saved. It's not me sitting at home saying, you know what, I'm going to go down there and introduce a new word into the vocabulary. No, it's right here in the Bible. Don't blame me. Well, why does Paul use the word saved? The word saved implies rescue, doesn't it? And that's what it is. We're rescued from what? Rescued from what? Well, here's what you're rescued from. Rescued from the situation in which we instinctively think we are in of getting what we deserve from God. Because let me just tell it to you this way. If it's the way people instinctively think it is, where there's a perfectly righteous and holy judge, and we're down here on earth, no matter who we are, we don't stand a chance. We don't stand a chance. See? But what we're rescued from is getting what we deserve. So Paul tells us, and I'm going to quote from another book, Romans chapter 6, the last verse, I think verse 23, it says, the wages of sin is death. And so if we get what's coming to us from God, we don't have anything coming to us except death. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't say the wages of sin is death, period. He says the wages of sin is death, comma, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. He says the gift of God. And here you notice that he uses the word gift again. So I wanted to talk about what grace is, because he says, by grace you're saved through faith. And our part is just to respond to God, just to believe in Him, just to put our faith in the message of His grace.